Good evening. As I explained yesterday, once a fortnight we're going to be doing story time. And we had some requests to do it a bit later this evening. So here I am, all ready. And the book that's been chosen is A Very Easy Death by Simone De Beauvoir. So this is not necessarily a feel-good book, but it is a very interesting book, and hopefully it's a very inspiring book. So we're going to begin this. I'm going to read one or two chapters, and we will continue it in a fortnight's time. And during that time, if you can think of any books that you'd like us to read and share, please send us a message. So let's begin. Do not go gentle into the good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. They're Dylan Thomas's words before we begin the story. We begin on chapter 1. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of Thursday, the 24th of October, 1963, I was in Rome, in my room in the hotel. I was about to fly home the next day, and I was putting my papers away when the telephone rang. It was Bost calling me from Paris. Your mother has had an accident, he said, and I thought she'd been knocked down by a car. She was climbing laboriously from the roadway to the pavement, leaning on her stick, and the car knocked her down. But no, she's had a fall in the bathroom. She'd broken her neck of her femur, said Bost. He lived in the same building as my mother. About 10 o'clock the evening before, he had been going up the stairs with Ogler, and had noticed 3 people ahead of them, a woman and 2 policemen. It's a landing above the second floor, the woman was saying. Had something happened to Madame? Yes, a fall. For 2 hours she had crawled across the floor before she could reach the telephone. She had asked a friend, Madame to have the door forced open. Bost and Ogler followed them up to the flat. They found Maman laying on the floor in her red corduroy dressing gown. Dr. Lacroix, a woman doctor who was living in the house, diagnosed a fracture of the neck of the femur. Mama had been taken away by the emergency service of the hospital, and she spent the night in the public ward. But I'm taking her to the C nursing home, Boss told me. That's where Professor B operates. Now he's one of the best bone surgeons. But she was right against it. She was afraid it would cost you too much, but I have persuaded her in the end. Poor Mamma. I had lunch with her just when I came back from Moscow 5 weeks before. She looked poorly, as usual. There had been a time, not very long ago, when she took pleasure in the thought that she did not look her age. Now, there could no longer be any mistake about it. She was a woman of 77, quite worn out, with arthritis in her hips, which had first appeared after the war, had grown worse year by year. In spite of massage and cures, it took an hour to make her way around the block of houses. She had a good deal of pain, and she barely slept, in spite of the 6 aspirin she took every day. For the last 2 or 3 years, and especially since last winter, I had seen her with dark rings around her eyes. Her face was thin and pinched look around her nose. It was nothing serious, said D, her doctor. An upset liver, sluggish bowels. He prescribed some drugs. Some tamarind jelly for the constipation. See, that day I had not been surprised at her feeling poorly. But what did surprise me and upset me was that she should have had a bad summer. She could have taken a holiday in the country hotel or a convent that took boarders, but she expected to be asked to stay at the Majerac by my cousin Jean, as she was every year, at the Schagerbergen, where my sister lived. Both of them were prevented from inviting her. So she stayed on in Paris. It rained, and the town was deserted. I'm never depressed, as you know, she said to me. But I was depressed then. Now, fortunately, a little while after, I paused through. My sister had had her stay in Alliance for the fortnight, and now her friends were in Paris again, and I was coming back. And but for that broken bone, I would have certainly have found her in good form for one more time. Her heart was in excellent condition, and her blood pressure was that of a young woman. I had never been afraid of a sudden mishap for her. So at about 6 o'clock, I telephoned her at the nursing home. I told her that I was on my way back and that I was coming to see her. She answered in a wavering, doubtful voice. Professor B took over the telephone. He was going to operate on Saturday morning. You haven't written me a letter for 2 months, she said, as I came towards her bed. I protested. We'd seen each other. I had sent a letter from Rome. She listened to me with an air of disbelief. Her forehead and hands were burning hot. Her mouth was slightly twisted. She had difficulty in articulating, and her mind was confused. Was this the side effect of the shock? Or had this been her fall been caused by a slight stroke? She'd always been or had a nervous tic. Or no, not always, but for a long time. But since when? She blinked. Her eyebrows went up. Her forehead wrinkled. For a second, there was a nervous moment that never stopped. For a second. And when her smooth, rounded eyelids came down, they completely covered her pupils. Dr. J, an assistant, looked in. There was no point in operating. The humour had not shifted, and with 3 months of rest, it would reknit. Mariam, Mama, seemed relieved. In a muddled way, she told me about her efforts to reach the telephone, her intense anxiety, the kindness of Boston Ogler. She had been taken to the hospital in her dressing gown, without any baggage at all. The next day, Olga had brought with her toilet things, some cologne, a pretty white wool bed jacket. When she said thank you, Olga had replied, "But I do it out of affection, madame." Several times, with an earnest, musing air, Mamma replied, "She said to me, I do it out of affection." And she repeated it. She seemed so ashamed of being a nuisance, so immensely grateful for what had been done for her. It was enough to break your heart. Olga told me that evening she spoke indignantly of Dr. D. He was annoyed at Dr. L having been called in and had refused to go and see Mamma at the hospital on Thursday. I stood there clutching the telephone for 20 minutes. Said Olga, after the shock and after her night in the hospital, your mother needed comforting by her usual doctor. He wouldn't listen to a word of it. Bost didn't think that Mamma had had a stroke. When it helped her up, she seemed a little bit bewildered, but was quite clear in her mind. He doubted whether she would recover in the 3 months. However, the breaking of the neck of the femur was not in itself a serious matter, but a long period of lying still in bed caused bed sores, and with old people, they did not heal. The lying position was tiring for the lungs. Patients would often develop pneumonia, and it carried them off. I was not very much affected. In spite of her fragility, my mother was tough, and after all, she wasn't of an age to die. Bost had told my sister, and I had a long talk with her on the telephone. I knew it would happen, she said. And Alced said she thought Mamma had aged so, and grown so weak, but she had said so to Linnell. She will never get through the winter. Now one night Mamma had had a violent abdominal pains, and she had very, very nearly asked to be taken into hospital. But in the morning, she was better. And when they took her home by car, charmed and delighted with her stay, as she put it, she had recovered her strength and her cheerfulness. But halfway through October, about 10 days before her accident, Francine Dato telephoned to my sister. I've just been having lunch with your mother. She seemed to me so poorly that I thought I ought to warn you. My sister invented an excuse for coming to Paris at once, and she took Mamma to a radiologist. When he had a look at the plates, her doctor stated categorically, "There is nothing for you to worry about." A kind of pocket had formed in the intestine, a visual pocket that made the movement of the bowels difficult. And then your mother does not eat enough, which would have caused deficiency, and she is in no danger. He advised Mamma to feed herself better and prescribed her new and very strongly acting medicines. But I was still worried, said Popette. I begged Mamma to have someone in at night, but she never would. She could not bear the idea of a strange woman sleeping in her flat. So Popette and I agreed that she could come over to Paris in a fortnight's time when I planned to leave for Prague. The next day, Mamma's mouth was still twisted and her speech somewhat troubled. Her long eyelids were drooping over her eyes and her eyebrows twitched. Her right arm, which had been broken 20 years before, fallen off a bicycle, had never really mended properly. Her recent fall had hurt her left arm. She could scarcely move either of them. Fortunately, she was being looked after with the greatest of care. Her room overlooked a garden, far from the noise of the street. Her bed had been moved, and they had put it along the wall that ran parallel to the window, so that the telephone, which was fixed to the wall, was within hand's reach. With her back propped up with pillows, she was sitting rather than lying. Her lungs would not get tired. Her pneumonic mattress, connected to the electrical device, vibrated, massaging her, and this was to prevent her bed sores. Every morning, a physiotherapist came in and exercised her legs. It seemed as if the dangers Bot had spoken about could all be averted. In her rather drowsy voice, Mamma told me that a maid cut up her meat and helped her to eat it, and that the meals were excellent, whereas at the hospital they'd given her black pudding and potatoes. Black pudding? For invalids? She talked more easily than on the day before. She went back over the 2 dreadful hours when she was dragging herself across the floor, wondering whether she would manage to get hold of the telephone flex and pull the instrument to her. One day I said to Madame Marchand, who also lives by herself, "Luckily, there is always the telephone." And she said to me, "But you still have to be able to get to it." And in a most significant voice, Mamma repeated the last words several times. She added, "If I had not managed to get there, I should have been done for." Would she have been able to shout loud enough to make herself heard? No, surely not. I pictured her distress. She believed in heaven, but in spite of her age, her feebleness, and her poor health, she clung ferociously to this world, and she had an animal dread of death. She told my sister of a nightmare that she often had. I'm being chased, and I run and I run, and I come against a wall, and I have to jump over the wall, and I do not know what there is behind it. It terrifies me. She also said to her, "Death itself does not frighten me. It's the jump I'm afraid of." So when she was creeping along the floor, she thought that the very moment for the jump had come. "It must have hurt dreadfully when you fell," I asked her. "No, I don't remember that it did. I don't remember even feeling it." Ah, so she lost consciousness, I thought. She remembered having felt giddy. She added that a few days before, when she had just taken one of her new medicines, she felt her legs giving way underneath her. She had just had time to lie down on her divan. I looked distrustfully at the bottles she was asked her young cousin, Martha, to bring from her flat, together with various other things. She was bent on continuing her treatment. Was this advisable? Professor B came to see her at the end of the day, and I followed him into the corridor. Once she had recovered, he said, "My mother would walk, no worse than before. She would be able to potter around again. Do you think she'd had a fainting fit?" "No, Not at all. He seemed disconcerted when I told him that her bowels had been giving her trouble. The Burkhardt had reported a broken neck of the femur, and he had confided himself to that. He would have examined by a physician. You will be able to walk just as you did before, I said to Mamma. You will be able to go back to a normal life. Oh, I shall never set foot in that flat again. I shall never want to see it any more. Not at that price. And she'd been so proud of that flat. She had come to loathe the one in the Rue de Rennes, which my father had filled with the noise of his ill temper as he grew older. After his death, and after my grandmother's, which happened very shortly after, she'd wanted to make a break from her memories. Some years earlier, a woman she knew had done up a studio, and this quite dazzled Mamma. In 1942, of course, it was easy enough to find somewhere to live, and she was able to make her dream come true. She rented a studio with a little gallery in the Rue Blomet. She sold the ebonized pear tree wood desk and the Henry II dining room suite, the double bed and the grand piano. She kept the rest of the furniture and some of the old red carpet. She hung my sister's paintings on the wall. She put a divan on the bedroom, and in those days she went up and down the inside staircase perfectly happily. I did not think the place really seemed very cheerful. It was on the second floor, and in spite of the big windows overhead, there wasn't really very much light. The upstairs, rooms, the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom, they were always dark. And it was there that Mamma spent most of her day, since the time every stair began to force a groan out of her. In the course of 20 years, everything, the walls, the furniture, the carpet, had grown worn and dirty. When the building changed hands in 1960 and Mamma imagined that she was going to be evicted, she thought of a rest home. She did not find anything she liked, and besides, she was very fond of her own place. She learned that one had the right to put her out. So she stayed on in the Rue Blomet. But now we, her friends and I, were going to look for a pleasant rest home, where she should settle as soon as she was better. You will never go back to that Rue Blomet, I promise you, I said. And on Sunday her eyes were still half closed. Her memory was drowsing, and the words came dropping heavily from her lips. She told me about her cavalry again. Yet there was one thing that comforted her, the fact that they had brought her to this clinic. She had an exaggerated notion of its excellence. At the Burkhardt, they said they would have operated on me yesterday. It appears that this is the best clinic in Paris. And since for her pleasure of praising was incomplete unless it was accompanied by blame, she added, referring to the nearby establishment, this is far better than the G Clinic. I have been told that the G Clinic is not all the thing. I have not slept so well for ages, she said to me on Monday. She had her normal look on again. Her voice was clear, and her eyes were taking notice of the things around her. Dr. Lacroix ought to be sent some flowers. I promised to see it. And what about the policeman? Shouldn't I give them something? I put them to great trouble. I found it hard to convince her that was not called for. She leaned back against her pillows, looked straight at me, and said very firmly, I've been overdoing it. You know that. I've tired myself out. I was at the end of my tether. I would not admit that I was old, but one must face up to these things. In a few days' time, I'm going to be 78, and that is a great age, and I must arrange my life accordingly. I'm going to start a new chapter, a fresh chapter. I gazed at her with admiration. For a great while, she had insisted upon considering herself young. Once, when her son-in-law made a clumsy remark, she had crossly replied, I know very well that I'm old, and I don't like it at all, and I don't care to be reminded of it. Suddenly, coming out of the fog she had been floating in these 3 past days, she found the strength to face her 78 years, clear-sighted and determined. I am going to start a fresh chapter. She had started a fresh chapter with astonishing courage after my father's death. It had grieved her very deeply indeed, but she had not bogged down in her past. She had taken advantage of the freedom that had been given her back after his death to build a kind of life for herself that matched her own tastes. My father did not leave her a penny, and she was 54. She passed examinations, attended courses, and she won a certificate that enabled her to work as an assistant librarian in the Red Cross. She learnt to ride a bicycle again, to go to her office. She thought of doing dressmaking at home after the war. When the time came that I was in a position to help her, but idleness did not suit her. She was eager to live in her own way, at last, and she discovered a whole mass of activities for herself. She looked after the library and an observation sanitarium just outside Paris as a volunteer, and then one that belonged to a Catholic club in her neighbourhood. She loved handling books, putting wrappers on them, arranging them, dealing with the tickets, giving advice to readers. She studied German and Italian, and she kept up with her English. She did embroidery at the dot class meetings, took part in charity sales, attended lectures. She made herself a great many new friends. She also took up again with former acquaintances and relations whom her father, surliness, had driven away, and she very cheerfully had invited them all to her studio. At last, she was able to satisfy one of her oldest longings and travel. She fought stubbornly against the anarchist that was stiffening in her legs. She went to see my sister in Vienna and Milan, and in the summer she tripped through the streets of Florence and Rome. She went to see the museums in Belgium and Holland, and during these last years, when she was almost paralyzed, she gave up hurrying around the face of the earth. But when friends or cousins invited her out of Paris or into the country, nothing would stop her. She would have hoisted herself onto the train by the guard without a second thought. Her greatest delight was to travel by car. A little while before, her great niece Catherine had taken her to the Mayennec, driving by night in a very, very little slow Citroën, close on 300 miles. She stepped out of the car as fresh as a blossom. Her vitality filled me with wonder, and I respected her courage. Why, as soon as she could speak again, did she utter words that froze me? Telling me of a night at the boy club, that she said, "You know that the women of the lower classes are like," they moan, "these hospital nurses. They are only there for the money, so—" They were ready-made phrases, as automatic as drawing breath, but it was still her consciousness that gave them life, and it was impossible to hear them without distress. The contrast between the truth of her suffering and the nonsense that came in her head, and that was stuffed. That's what saddened me. The physiotherapist came to Mamma's bed and turned down the sheet and took hold of her left leg. Mamma had an open hospital nightdress on, and she did not mind that her wrinkly belly, crisscrossed with tiny lines, and her bald pubis showed. "I no longer have any sort of shame," she observed in a sort of surprised voice. "You are perfectly right not to have any," I said. But I turned away and I gazed into the garden. The sight of Mum's nakedness had jarred me. No body existed less for me. No one existed more. As a child, I had loved it dearly. As an adolescent, it filled me with an uneasy repulsion. All this was perfectly in the ordinary course of things, and it seemed reasonable to me that her body should retain its dual nature, that it should be both repugnant and wholly a taboo. But for all of that, I was astonished at the violence of my distress. My mother's indifference made it worse. She was abandoning the prohibitions that had oppressed her all of her long life, and I approved of her doing so. Only this body, suddenly reduced by her capitulation to being a body and nothing more, hardly differed at all from a corpse, a poor, defenceless carcass, turned and manipulated by professionals, one in which life seemed to carry on only because of its own stupid momentum. For me, my mother had always been there, and I had never seriously thought that some day, that soon, I should see her go. Her death, like her birth, had its place in some legendary time. When I said to myself, "She is of an age to die," the words were devoid of meaning, as so many words are. For the first time, I saw her as a dead body under suspended sentence. The next morning, I went to buy the night dresses that the nurses had asked for. Short ones, otherwise they would be wrinkled under the patient's bottom, which would cause bed sores. "Do you want shorties, baby doll nightgowns, or a baby doll nightdress?" asked the shop assistant. I fingered frothing night things as nonsensical as their names, as pastel colours made for young people, happy bodies. It was a lovely autumn day with a blue sky, and I made my way through a lead-coloured world. And I realised that my mother's accident was affecting me far more than I thought it would. I could not really see why. It had wrenched me out of the framework, the role, the set of images in which I had imprisoned her. I recognised her in this patient in bed, but I did not recognise either the pity or the kind of disturbance that she aroused in me. Finally, I decided upon some pink three-quarter nightgowns with white spots. Now, Dr. T, who was looking after Mama, general condition, came to see her while I was there. "Now it seems you eat too little." "I was depressed this summer. I didn't have the heart to eat." "Did you find cooking a nuisance?" "Well, what happened is that I made myself little treats, and then I left them." "Ah, so it wasn't laziness then. So you made yourself little treats." Mamma concentrated. "Once I made myself a cheese souffle. After 2 spoonfuls, I couldn't eat any more." "Ah, I see," said Dr. T with a condescending smile. Dr. J, Professor B, Dr. T, neat, trim, shining, well-groomed, bending over his ill-kept, rather wild-looking old woman from an immense height. Great men, bigwigs. I recognised that piddling self-importance. It was that of the judges on the bench when they have a man whose life is at stake before them. "So you make yourself little treats." There was no reason to smile while Mamma was searching her memory with trustful willingness. It was her health that was at stake. And what was right had B to say to me, "She will be able to potter around again." I objected to the scale of his values. I bristled when the privileged classes spoke through my mother's mouth. But I felt wholly on the side of the bedfast invalid struggling to thrust back paralysis and death. Now, on the other hand, I did like the nurses. They were linked to their patient by the extreme closeness of those necessary tasks that were humiliating for her and revolting for them. Their interest they took in Mamma did at least leave or have the appearance of friendship. Mille Laurent, the physiotherapist, could raise her spirits, give her a sense of security and calm, and she never assumed any superiority. "We will have your stomach x-rayed tomorrow," said Dr. T finally. Mamma was distressed. "So you're going to make me swallow that horrible stuff?" "Oh, it's not as bad as all that." "Oh, but it is." When she was alone with me, she said pitifully, "I can't tell you how nasty it is. It tastes vile." "Don't think about it in advance." But she could not think about anything else. Ever since she had entered the nursing home, the food had been her chief preoccupation. Still, her childhood concern surprised me. She had borne a great deal of sickness and pain without wincing. Was there a deeper anxiety hiding behind the fear of an unpleasant preparation? I did not ask myself that at the time. The next day, they told me that the x-rays, stomach and lungs, had gone off very well, and that there was nothing out of order. Mamma, looking calm, wearing out one of the pink nightgowns with the white spots and the bed jacket that Olga had lent her, and with her hair in a big plait, no longer had the look of a sick woman. The use of her left arm had come back to her, and she could unfold a piece of paper, open a book, or pick up the telephone without any help. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, she did crosswords, she read a book on Voltaire in Love and Jean de Leray account of his expedition in Paris and Brazil. She looked through Le Figaro and Francois, and I came every morning. I only stayed an hour or two. She did not want to keep me any longer. She had a great many visitors, and sometimes she indeed complained that she had too many. She would say, "I've seen too many people today. The room is full of flowers." And on her bedside table there were boxes of chocolates and sweets. "Don't you get bored?" I asked her. Oh no. She was discovering the pleasures of being waited upon, looked after, petted. Before, she had to make a great effort to climb over the edge of a bath. Helping herself with a stool, putting on her stockings, had meant painful contortions. But now, a nurse came every morning and evening and rubbed her with a cognac and powdered her with talcum powder. Her meals were brought her on a tray. "There's one nurse who irritates me," she said. "She asks me when I expect to leave. But I don't want to leave. Not at all." And when she was told that presently she would be able to sit up in an armchair and that presently she would be transferred to a convalescent home, her face clouded over. "They're going to hustle me, and they're going to push me about." Yet there were times when she concerned herself with the future. A friend had talked to her about rest homes and only an hour from Paris. And she said, "No one will come and see me. I shall be too lonely." She said that really unhappily, and I assured her that she would not have to go into exile, and I showed her the list of addresses that I'd gathered. She was quite happy to think of herself reading or knitting in the sun, in the garden of a home. A little regretfully, but not without irony, she said, "The people in my quarter are not going to be sorry to see me any more. The women at the club will miss me. Once," she said to me, "I have lived for others too much. Now I shall become one of those self-centered old women who only live for themselves." Now one thing worried her. I shan't be able to wash or dress myself any more. I set her mind at rest. An attendant and nurse would look after that. Meanwhile, she was happily taking her ease in one of her beds at the best nursing home in Paris. So much better than the G Clinic. They paid the closest attendance to her. As well as the x-rays, there had been several blood tests, and everything was normal. Her temperature rose in the evening. I would have liked to know why, but the nurse did not seem to think it at all significant. "I saw too many people yesterday and they tired me," she told me on Sunday, and she was in a bad mood. Her usual nurses were off duty, and an inexperienced girl had upset the bedpan full of urine. The bed and even the bolster had been soaked. She closed her eyes often, and her recollection was confused. Dr. T could not make out the plates that Dr. D had sent, and the next day there was to be a fresh intestinal x-ray. "They will give me a Bavarian enema. Ugh, and it hurts," Mamma told me. "And they are going to shake me around again and trundle me around again. I should so like to be left in peace." I pressed her damp, rather cold hand. "Don't think about it in advance. Don't worry. Worrying is bad for you." Gradually, her spirits came back, but she seemed weaker than the day before. Friends telephoned and answered. "Well," I said to her, "there was no end to it. The Queen of England wouldn't have been more spoilt. Flowers, letters, sweeties, telephone calls. What quantities of people think of you." I was holding her tired hand. She kept her eyes shut, but there was a small, faint smile on her very sad mouth. "They like me because I am cheerful." She expected many visitors on Monday, and I was busy, and I did not come until Tuesday morning. I opened the door and stopped dead. Mamma, who was so thin, seemed to have grown still thinner, and more shriveled and wizened, and had grown thinner dried up, a pinkish twig. In a somewhat bewildered voice, she whispered, "They have dried me out completely." She had waited until the evening to be x-rayed, and for 20 hours on end they had not even allowed her a drink. The barbarian enema had not hurt, but the thirst and the anxiety had worn her out. Her face had dissolved with the tense unhappiness. What were the result of the x-rays? "We can't understand them," the nurses replied in frightened voices. "I managed to see Dr. T. The information the plates gave were obscure. According to him, there was no pocket, but the bowel was contorted by spasms, nervous in origin, but had also prevented it from working since the day before. My mother, obstinately sanguine, but for all of that, she was anxious and highly strung. That was the explanation for her tics. She was too exhausted to see visitors, and she asked me to telephone Father P, her confessor, and put him off. She scarcely spoke to me, and she could not manage a smile. "I'll see you tomorrow evening," I said as she left. My sister was arriving during the night, and I would go to the clinic in the morning. At 9 in the evening, my telephone rang. It was Professor B. "I should like to have a night nurse for your mother. Do you agree?" "She is not well." "You thought of not coming until tomorrow evening? It would be better to be there in the morning." In the end, he told me that there was a tumour blocking the small intestine. Mama had cancer. Cancer. It was all about us. Indeed, it was patently obvious. Those ringed eyes, the thin lips, but a doctor had ruled out that hypothesis. And it was notorious that the parents are the last to admit that their son is mad. The children that their mother has cancer. We believed it all the less, since that was what she had been afraid of the most all of her life. When she was 40, if she had knocked her chest against a piece of furniture, she grew terribly frightened. I now shall have cancer of the breast. Last winter, one of my friends had been operated upon for cancer of the stomach. That's going to happen to me too. I'd shrugged. There was a very wide difference between cancer and sluggishness of bowels that is treated with jelly. We never imagined that Mama's obsession could be justified. Yet, she told us this later. It was cancer that Francine Detto had thought of. I recognised that expression. And, she added, that smell too. Everything became clear. Mama's sudden illness in the alcove rose from the tumour. The tumour had caused her fainting fit in her fall, and these 2 weeks of bed rest had brought on the blockage of the intestine that had been threatening for a long time. Pipette, who had phoned Mama several times, thought she was in excellent health. Pipette was closer to her than I was, and she was fonder of her too. I could not let her come to the nursing home and all at once see death on her face. I telephoned her at the day a little while after the train had got in. She was already asleep. What an awakening. On that Wednesday, the 6th of November, the gas, the electricity, the public transport were on strike. I asked Boss to come and fetch me by car. Before he arrived, Professor B telephoned again. Mama had vomited all night long. In all likelihood, she would not get through the day. The streets were less blocked with traffic than I had feared. At about 10, I met Pipette outside the door of room 114. I repeated what Professor B had said. She told me that since the beginning of the morning, a resuscitation expert, Dr. N, had been working on Mama. He was going to put a tube into her nose to clean out her stomach. But what's the good of tormenting her if she's dying? Let her pass in peace, said Pipette in tears. I sent her down to Bost, who was waiting in the hall. He would take her down to have some coffee. Dr. M passed by me. I stopped him. white coat, white cap, a young man with an unresponsive face. Why this tube? Why torch, Mamma? Why is there no hope? He gave me a withering look. I am doing what needs to be done. He opened the door, and after a moment, the nurse told me to come in. The bed was back in its ordinary place in the middle of the room, with its head against the wall. On the left, there was an intravenous dripper connected with Mamma's arm. From her nose, there emerged a tube of transparent plastic that passed through some complicated apparatus and ended in a jar. Her nose was pinched and her face was shrunk even more. It had the saddest air in submission. In a whisper, she told me that the tube did not worry her too much, but that during the night she'd suffered a great deal. She was thirsty, and she was not allowed to drink. The nurse put a thin tube to her mouth with the other end in a glass of water. Mamma moistened her lips without swallowing. I was fascinated by the sucking motion. At once avid and restrained, her lip, with its faint downy shadow, was rounded just as it had been rounded in my childhood, whenever Mamma was cross or embarrassed. Would you like me to have left that in her stomach? Said N aggressively. Show me the jar of all this yellowish substance. I did not reply. In the corridor, he said, at dawn, she has scarcely 4 hours left. I have brought her back to life. I did not venture to ask him. But for what for? Consultation of specialists, my sister at my side, while a physician and a surgeon, Dr. P, pipette, the swollen abdomen, Mamma groans under their fingers as she cries out, morphine injection, she groans, another injection, we beg. They're against it. Too much morphine would paralyze the intestine. What are they hoping for then? There is no electricity because of the strike, and they have sent a blood sample to the American hospital, which has its own generator. And they are thinking of operating. That's hardly possible, the surgeon tells me as he leaves the room. The patient's too weak. He walks away. An elderly nurse, Madame Gonttrade, who has heard him, bursts out, Don't let her be operated on. And then she claps her hands to her mouth. If Dr. N knew I had said that to you, I was speaking as if it was my own mother. But I questioned her. What will happen if they do operate on her? But she'd closed up again. She did not answer. Mamma had gone to sleep, and I went away, leaving. Telephone numbers were prepared. When she called me at Saturday's place at about 5, there was hope in her voice. The surgeon wants to try and operate. The blood analyses are very encouraging. Her strength has come back, and her heart will stand it. And after all, it is not as if he's absolutely sure that it is cancer. Perhaps it's just something that looks like cancer. And if it is, she has a chance. Do you agree? Don't let them operate on her. Yes, I agree. But when? Be here by 2. They will not tell her they are going to operate. They will just say they're going to take her to an X-ray again. Don't let them operate on her. A frail argument against the decision of the specialist. A frail argument against my sister's hopes. Mamma may not wake up. That was not the worst way out. And I did not imagine that the surgeon would take the risk. She would get over it. Would the operation hasten the development of the disease? I doubt that. No doubt that is what Madame Gonttrade meant. But with the intestinal obstruction at this stage, Mamma could not survive 3 days, and I was terribly afraid that her death might be appalling. An hour after the telephone, and Pipette sobbing, Come at once. They have operated, and they have found a huge cancerous tumour. Sartre went down with me. He took me in a taxi as far as the nursing home, my throat constricted with anguish. A male nurse showed me the lobby, between the entrance hall and the operating theatre, where my sister was waiting. Oh, she was so upset, but I asked for a tranquilizer for her. She told me that the doctors had warned Mamma, in a very natural voice, but before x-raying her, they would give her a sedative. Dr. N had put her to sleep, prepared to hold Mamma's hand right through the anaesthetic, and I could imagine what a trial it would have been for her. The sight of that old, ragged body, quite naked, that body which was her mother's. Mamma's eyes had turned up, her mouth hadn't opened. Pipette would never be able to forget that face either. They had wheeled her into the operating theatre, and Dr. Venn had come out a moment later, 4 pints of pus in the abdomen. The perineum had burst, a huge tumour, a cancer of the worst kind. The surgeon was removing everything that could be removed. While we were there, waiting, my cousin Jeannie came in with her daughter Chantal, who had just come back from Le Mans, and she thought we should find Mamma quietly in bed. Chantal had brought a book of crossword puzzles. We discussed what we should say to Mamma when she woke up. It was easy enough. The X-ray had shown that she'd had some appendicitis and had an operation that had been decided upon at once. Mamma had been taken up to her room and told us. He was triumphant. She had been half dead that morning, and yet she had withstood a long and serious operation excellently. Thanks to the very latest methods of anesthesia, her heart, lungs, and her whole organism had continued to function normally. There was no doubt that the sort of entirely washed hands of consequences that featured. My sister had said to the surgeon, "Operate on Mamma, but if it's cancer, promise me you will not let her suffer." He had promised, but what was his word worth now? Mamma was sleeping, lying on her back, her face the colour of wax, her nose pinched, her mouth open. My sister and the night nurse would sit her up. I went home. I talked to Satre. We played some Bartok. Suddenly at 11, an outburst of tears that almost degenerated into hysteria. Amazement. When my father died, I did not cry at all. I had said to my sister, "It will be the same for Mamma." I had understood all my sorrows up until that very night. Even when they flowed over my head, I recognized myself. This time, my despair escaped from my control. Someone other than me was weeping. I talked to Satre about my mother's death and my mother's mouth, as if I'd seen it in the morning. I talked about everything I had interrupted in it. The greediness, the refusal, the severe humility, hope, distress, loneliness, the loneliness of her death, and of her life, and that did not want to admit his existence. And he told me that my own mouth was not obeying me in spite of myself. I copied his movements. Her whole person, her whole being, was concentrated there, and compassion wrung my heart. And that is the end of chapter 1. A Very Easy Death is a long considered masterpiece. This is a profoundly moving piece of work, and it shows the compassion of her mother's death and the compassion of how we analyse it. I've chosen this book to read over the next few weeks because a lot of us have suffered from family deaths, friends' deaths due to COVID, and I just know that this book is a insightful, thoughtful, complex, interesting, thought-provoking analysis of death of a loved one. So it's not at all morbid, but it is a really interesting reflection. And I hope you've enjoyed the first chapter, and we will meet again in 2 weeks' time for the second. Thank you very much for joining me on this story time, and I'll see you again soon.